Maxed Out Man, helping you become the man you were made to be.
Hey guys, it's Kevin Davis from the Maxed Out Man podcast, and today I am here with Jake Stika. We were just discussing the proper pronunciation of his last name, so I'll welcome him here in a minute. But I want to let you know, if you're looking for more information about Maxed Out Man, go to maxedoutman.com. You can find us on all the social medias as well. We're getting ready to, we're doing currently a new coaching program, which will have probably ended by the time this launches. But make sure you go to maxedoutman.com and look at some of our challenges and some of the other things that we have to offer. So, hey, Jake is a passionate speaker and facilitator focused on gender-based issues related to social and emotional development of young men, the health and well-being of men in communities, and gender equality in workplaces. This is a topic I'm particularly interested in just overall. We've had a very diverse group of men come talk on this podcast about these similar issues. But one of the things we talk a lot about is kind of young men in particular, and what's happening to boys becoming young men, and kind of this environment that we're currently facing, and how that impacts their view of masculinity or fear of masculinity in some cases. So I'm particularly interested in that. But hey, there's your like LinkedIn quick bio. But tell us, kind of give us, and take as long as you want, but give us kind of your background and how you got here. And I know you've been doing this particular avenue for over 10 years. And so fill us in.
Geez, where to begin? I'm starting to feel like Star Wars in a galaxy far, far away. You know?
That's right. We just have those rolling credits.
Exactly. I mean, there's different parts of my story that I think make me who I am. So I'll start with the fact that I was born in what was then Czechoslovakia. I actually came to Canada in the early 90s as a refugee. So, I'm a tall, straight, white dude. I've had a lot of privilege in my life in those ways. But, growing up an immigrant and English as a second language and not having money, I think gave me a little bit of a different lens than the average white guy. Then I grew up, I was tall. I'm 6'8", and so, my first sport was soccer, and wasn't very good at that. And because I was tall, people were like, you should try basketball. And so I started playing basketball, and that then basically from grade 5 through to 24 was my big part of my identity, if not like Jake the basketball player, And
so your first name was either Jake the basketball player or Jake. Hi, Jake. You're super tall, right?
Yeah, totally.
I have tall friends, and for whatever reason, people love to point out the obvious, like you didn't realize that you have to duck going through a typical door frame, right? Like this is a surprise, but yeah.
Yeah, my friend group, I just got back from a guy's trip to Portland, and two other guys in the group are ex-basketball players, and they're like 6'4", 6'5". And there's one other guy 6'2", and we tease him for being the little one.
The little guy, right?
Yeah.
That's funny.
So, basketball was a big part of my identity, and it was pretty good. Got to university with that, but I started studying something that I just didn't have a lot of connection to, and my first year was really hard. And I was academically ineligible to play my second year. And
oh, wow.
So then I'm robbed of my identity as Jake the basketball player. I'm just, some student at school who's struggling. And my coping mechanisms at 19 were binge drinking and fist fights. And I ended up flunking out of that first university that I went into, transferred schools, found a program that I connected with more, smaller class sizes, walked onto their basketball team. 3 years later, I guess I'm a Canadian all-academic athlete. Life's back on track, but boom, I'm hit with depression again. And at 22, my coping mechanism is self-harm. And through that, and dating a women's studies grad at the time, I went to therapy, counseling. I really came to understand this masculine script. You got to be tough. You should never show emotion. You should never ask for help. That was harming me. And that was kind of my awakening to issues relating to masculinity. As I was going through that, my best friend who I co-founded the organization with, unfortunately lost his 13-year-old brother to suicide in 2007. He was a young black man experiencing homophobic bullying. So my best friend's named Jamal. Jamal's loss and grief and my own kind of struggles, I think we formed a male friendship that a lot of guys don't get the benefit of around, emotional support and vulnerability and being there for one another. And so, we just kind of came of age together that way. And then, Jamal went off and he started working with at-risk youth. And I did play like a little bit of basketball in Europe, but then, retired at the ripe age of 24. And I got an entry-level job as a business analyst. I worked in business development and sales for a startup. But all the while, I started fundraising for the November Foundation, men's health and those types of things. And in 2014, I guess it was, maybe 2013, they had a call for proposals for new ideas to change the face of men's health in Canada. And, I read about this other organization doing work with young men, and I thought, this is inspiring. And my best friend works with at-risk youth, and I work in a startup, and if these idiots can do it, I can do it.
Right.
So I pitched the idea to Movember, and they asked us to, get a little bit more rigor. So we brought in a third co-founder, who has a master's in public health, named Jason, and with him on board, they gave three knuckleheads $150,000 to start a youth program. And that's kind of I think the highlights of maybe who I am and the experiences I've had that led me to co-founding this organization a decade ago.
Nice. Yeah, that's a ton. That's a great story. I'm curious about your journey into basketball in terms of like not the sport aspect of it, but like, hey, you're tall, you should, right? Like, is that kind of how it went, or did you actually like try it and have a genuine love for it and then pursue it because of that, or pursuing it out of not obligation to others, but also like obligation to your own physicality, right? Like, I think in some cases we can do that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And I think the early days, I was tall and I was playing like house league and not very coordinated or skilled or any of those types of things, but enjoying it, having fun. And then I remember this kind of crossroads. I think it was like grade 7, grade 8, and there was an opportunity for me to try out for a club team. And I tried out for the club team, and it's a little fuzzy to me now exactly what it was, but there was kind of like this higher club team and lower club team. Mm-hmm. And I didn't quite make the higher club team. I made the lower club team. And I went through that season. That was the first time I had like a really serious coach. Like, before it was a lot of, dads helping out and, maybe they played some basketball growing up, but this was like the first time I had a serious coach. And I think I started to really learn the value of like mastery and effort and output. And at the end of the season, I got a trophy, most improved player. And so not like, MVP or anything like that, but like you put in the work and we're recognizing you out of that. And I think the bug just got me. And so that was, grade 8. And then at that point in time, grade 9, I was like 6'3", 6'4", and so I quickly fell into like club and junior varsity, lost in the city championships a couple times, and then just made away. But that being said, coaches make or break you, and they create that culture, that environment. And I was really unlucky in my post-secondary. I had a lot of coaches that I did not get along with and that did not set a good culture. And I think it's an absolute fluke that I did manage to play 1 year overseas. I think I don't know how much you're following some of the like Hockey Canada stuff in Canada going on right now with sexual assault allegations and those types of things. And I think, we like to paint whether it's athletes or coaches as maybe a couple bad apples, but we really got to look at the system in these types of things. And I think there's a way of looking at coaching as an opportunity to influence the next generation, not only on the ice or on the court, but how they want to show up as men in their communities and in their families and those types of things. Or there's the I went through this grind, so that means you have to go through the grind even harder than I did because that's what's going to make you this thing. And I'm going to play psychological games with you to try to get the best out of you. And so I think there's an interesting thing to look at there as well too.
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, I think coaching and teaching is just like anything else in life. But I'm in the automotive world also, and we have a lot of people that are good at something, and then they decide they need to teach other people how to be good at that thing when they really should just be good at that thing, and they have absolutely no skill whatsoever for coaching and teaching and leading, right? Like, and that's not to disparage anybody. I'm just saying that there are coaches that were awesome players and have absolutely no business being a coach. They may know the mechanics, they may know strategy from a player, but like, especially in younger sports, and especially in my mind when it comes to young boys, because this is like, they probably have one of the single most important and most influential positions in that boy's life. And so, like you said, make or break, right? Like, they're either going to screw this kid up for years, or they're going to catapult him into a life of, everything we want to be as men, right?
Just to highlight the importance of the coach's role, early childhood education is a female dominant field. There's some times where young men, the first male teacher they'll have, it'll probably be middle school. Maybe they'll have some gym teachers and maybe they'll have some principals or whatnot. But the field of basically like preschool to grade 6 is so many female teachers. And so outside of school, if they're in a sporting environment and they have a male coach, oftentimes that male coach may be one of the only role models of what masculinity is outside of that young man's father, grandfather, uncle, their immediate circle. And so, we want to have a diversity of masculinities as well too, but you want to have hopefully a healthy masculinity as a coach who supports you, encourages you, invites you to develop a love for the game. It is an incredibly important role.
Yeah, and in my case, my parents were divorced. I had a single mom that was addicted to various substances, so I really had no adult or male role models at that time, other than like whatever guy my mother was dating at the time, right? So that's not a healthy thing. But I did have coaches and youth leaders that I think back and I'm like, these guys were like 22 years old at the time, right? Like they were just young men themselves, but they did show that. And it's got to be difficult in a coaching environment too, because there is like this war aspect of sports, right? Like we're here because you require to be tough no matter what sport you're doing, right? But there's also this camaraderie and all that. I had this discussion with my youngest daughter, who's 24, and she made what I believed, and to your point about it, there's a systemic issue here too, but she made the point like all football players are racist or are rapists. And I'm like, no, they're not all, right? Like there may be something systemic that creates a culture in which that could be more prominent or more leaned into or whatever. But you get the right coach, we can think of major coaches that you can see or have that impact in a good way, right? To turn these boys really into men. One of my favorite movies is called Facing the Giants. It's actually a Christian movie, but it's about a football team. And it has a Christian theme to it, but it's that camaraderie and that, working together for the good is what really drove, one of the reasons I love that movie. But side note on that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I've been thinking a lot about this because obviously sports is a place that I was formed into who I am. And I think it's a place for transformation. And I think there's a subtle nuance that like that war, that like, toughness, that grit, that grind, whatever it is that for the purpose of the outcome or the purpose of the process?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's for the purpose of the outcome, you will always be incentivized to take shortcuts, right? And you'll fall in love with the idea of winning at all costs or those types of things. But if it's for the process, and the process is, we're going to go compete, we're going to go play hard against this team, they're going to be our challenger, and they're going to try to bring out the best in us or the worst in us, and how do we overcome that? And how do we then bring that into practice? And how do we bring that into the weight room? And how do we bring that into the fact that last year you were benching this, and this year you're benching this, and last year you were running at that speed, and this year you're running at that speed? Like, that's the process, right? And we can always come back to that work, and not villainize the other people, because they're just a foil in the process as well too. And I think that that's where really like that coaching philosophy comes from. And your daughter's comment, like I empathize with her. I think that we live in a culture and a society where gender-based violence is so prevalent, and being a young woman, it can be an incredibly scary place. And so something like that is set out of existing in that type of world. And even if that's not necessarily the case, I think that we could probably say that a lot of men in our society are complicit, because they hear the sexualized jokes, the rape jokes, the whatever, and they don't call that out. They don't say, hey, that's not okay in our community, right? And that doesn't make them, all rapists, like she said, but like we as men uphold this culture. And I think that's really what Next Gen Men is trying to do to, maybe build a bridge into our further conversation, is to say, hey, like, what kind of culture, what kind of masculinity and community do we want to be a part of, and what role do we play in that?
Yeah. And because there are some young men that, I've met that are it's almost by nature, but I think there's also a nurturing component, 15, 16, 17, that are natural leaders, right? And are actually teaching their peers exactly what you're saying, which is, hey, look, that's not something we do. I had a guest on my podcast named Larry Broughton, who's a businessman, but he had lost his son. And I've told this story a few times, but if you haven't heard it on the podcast, I'll tell it again anyway. His son passed away at 17. And Larry had been teaching his son all of these things about how to be a man, in various aspects, with respect and integrity and all those. And young teenager, right? Like, I don't care what you say, Dad, that's a bunch of crap, whatever. And then at his son's funeral, he had like 12 different young men stand up and mention, and dude, I get choked up at this story every time I tell it, and say, hey, your son taught me how to stand up to shake hands. Your son taught me that it's okay to open a door for a woman, or to treat her with respect, or, to how to deal with other men in my life, and all of those things. But it was like 12 different young men. And so that kid had taken what his dad had taught him and passed it along as a leader in his small community of other boys. Right.
Yeah. And that to me just shows the transformative power, like, whether like it's easier as a boy to look up to a man because, masculinity, it's a familiar thing or whatnot. But like at the bare minimum, every child needs an adult that is caring and connected to them, and that is going to be an anchor for them as they navigate the rough waters of life into their own adulthood. Right? If they have that, chances are they'll turn out okay. And if they have an adult beyond that who is, so caring and doting and wants to like build that up, that not only impacts that young person, but that impacts that young person's community. And so I think there's, and I have empathy for parents these days. Like, it's really expensive and we're always working. And like, there's all these things that are in our way of giving that time, care, and attention. But you see, when you tell that story, that the time, care, and attention that father gave to his son goes out into the community. And now imagine if every father was that engaged, that caring, that committed, what kind of our community we would all exist within.
Yeah, and to be able to pass that along, right, and to take the time and effort to teach, and I want to dig into this more with you whenever I saw what you do and was reading on some of your stuff. It's like, how are we? I have this ideal that or idea, I guess, that it's these young men now are in an environment where they really don't even know what masculinity looks like, or we're actually creating an environment where young men are afraid to be whatever kind of man they are, right? I've talked about in the past that I would represent kind of the stereotypical upper middle class white guy, right? But one that is like, I work out 6 days a week. I like cars. I tend to be more traditional and my wife and I have a fairly traditional role, but let me preface that by saying she's a welder. She's also a boxer. We spent a ton of time in the women in the trades thing. So that's kind of my preface for that. Not like she was a homemaker most of the time our kids were growing up, but then she kind of came into she's rally racer and all this other stuff. But we have a fairly traditional thing, right? So like I almost become the anti-hero in the masculine story because I am what I would consider traditionally masculine, what you would think. However, as I've talked about many times, I can tell that story and get choked up and not worry about what people think of me. I have deep relationships with my close male friends. I tell them I love them. I ask about their wives and their kids, and like we have this deep connection. But on the surface, you would not assume that, right? Like you would assume I'm a certain way. How do we get through? First of all, can you verify that that's the case, or tell me about what you think about that? And how do we kind of navigate through what's going on with this stuff?
First of all, the way that I kind of talk about where we're at is that masculinity is between stories. And there used to be an old story of what it was. And, that story was handed down to us by our great grandfathers, our grandfathers, and fathers. But it's been shifting over generations now. And we don't know what the next story is. We're writing it. And I think in that space of not knowing, and this doesn't have to be masculinity in general, like, say anything in the world, in a space of not knowing, a lot of people will be very uncomfortable. Some will see it as an opportunity and like be very imaginative and creative and try to like write that story. Others will cling to what they know and go backwards and grasp for that familiarity and that stability. And I think that's kind of culturally where we are right now. But when I hear your story and your thoughts about this, I myself too, like, giant, 6'8" white dude, beard, like very traditional, like masculine presence. There's definitely assumptions that people make about us, and we can't necessarily help that because, there's media, their own lived experiences and those types of things. But when I hear about, your wife and, your solidness and your ability to like emote and stuff, to me, that's like a very healthy form of masculinity. It's like, this is who I am. This is what I'm comfortable with. But like, this is where I think the big, debate or war on this is, I don't hear you saying the way I am is how every other guy should be.
Right.
And I think that's where we need to get to a place with masculinity is multiple masculinities. Yours is different than mine, is different than that person's. And that's okay, right? There's got to be a diversity of ways of being. And none of us you're not more than because you like cars, and you're not less than because your wife has an income and is a rally racer. It's just, it just is, and you're comfortable in that. And, I think of the word integrity, and I think people, when they hear integrity, they hear, someone who holds their word, someone who's trustworthy. But I think of the actual root of it, it's integrated. And I think we need to strive for an integrated masculinity. And what that means is comfort with fluidity, because the chances are your masculinity is different with your partner. It's different on this podcast. It's different when you're in a car shop. It's different when you're with your daughter. And there's not like one solid way of being a man for you. And so why do we keep trying to say like, this is the way of being a man? When you can sit in that and understand that your masculinity is fluid and that you're comfortable with it, then you're integrated and you're at peace, and you can hold space for other people to do that in their lives as well too. And so that's what I would say is like, we're between stories. There's, multiple masculinities and a breadth of that. And then when you can sit in that, you get like the peace of being an integrated man.
I like that phrase, integrated man. And again, to your point, it looks different for us in different roles. And some people would say, okay, well, that's just a mask you live, which to a degree, we all put on masks in different, like when I'm in this mode, or if I'm doing public speaking or I'm at an event, I have a different countenance, the way I greet people and all that is slightly different. It's not that much different, which actually can get me in trouble sometimes. But obviously the tenderness that I have with my wife and those kind of things are not going to be heavy in those those environments, because it just didn't fit. But it's with like Maxed Out Man, for example, and the coaching we do and all that. One of the things we're navigating is that we have kind of we have 3 pillars. We have the man, which is health and fitness, sleep, stress, all those things that kind of your physicality side. Then mission, which is your legacy, your purpose, and those kind of things. And then we have marriage, and it's a servant leader. It's servant leadership, and it's being a loving leader, right? Like, and so it's this way of kind of navigating that. But also, like, we may have a coach. We're doing this new coaching program that we're doing our kickoff call tonight. And one of the guys is a good friend of mine. He has no desire to go to the weight room like I do 6 days a week and try to be fit and muscular. He could lose a little bit of weight. He knows that. He knows that he's not as healthy as he can be. So that may look like hiking or some sort of sports or something like that. But like, I'm not going to say in order to be fit and healthy, you have to have X number percentage of body fat and be muscular, right? And so that is just a physicality aspect of what you're talking about. But the way I emote is going to be different than the way other men emote. And it's a funny story, and I probably told this before, but my kids my kids typically go to Michelle, my wife, for more of the nurturing. I want to talk about this for 30 minutes, go through each little aspect of it, which I can do also, but I also tend to be the guy, and they say this, they like, Dad, I need you to give me the stop being a little bitch talk, which is a very aggressive way to say, hey, I need some tough love, because I tend to be more pragmatic and all that, which is like, stop watching Netflix and go do your homework, or you're going to fail this class. And so that's like simple advice. But all that to say, it's really interesting that you say integrated man and integrated masculinity, because that's really what we're all striving for in this space, right? Like, we want men and young men to have that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only thing that I would like push back a little bit is why do we have to use the word of mask in this situation or that situation, right? Like, you have, I don't know, the joke about like facial muscles, and there's so many muscles to make you smile and so many to make you frown or whatever, right? We have all those muscles, right? We don't need to put a different mask on top of it. We can have fluidity in how we show up, so that we don't need to just be a hard ass at work. Like you said, it even how you are with your kids. You can step into the I bet if your daughter came to you and she said, Dad, like, I have a problem. I know your default, like, mom's not available. Mom's driving a rally race right now, and she's not available. I have this issue, Dad, and I know your default is to be a problem solver, but I really just want you to like hear me out and ask me how I feel. In that moment, you can be like, got it, I can do that.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And
I
so,
do that with my own wife. Like, I'll even ask her when she tells me a story, is this something you want me to try to help you solve, or you just need my ears, basically, and and my arms in order to give you a hug, right? Like, that's the difference between those two things.
Perfect. And that's exactly it. It's just, how do we give ourselves and other men around us the permission to be fluid like that. To be, the CEO who is fearless and is driving, outcomes, etc., but then has a bad year, says, I made a bad call and I'm really sorry, I have to lay off 10% of the workforce, and get emotional about it and say
Yeah.
that's the same person because he contains multitudes. Because we see that authenticity and integration of like the fearlessness and the compassion, that like, wow, we have such respect and admiration for that.
Yeah, and I like that you called me out a little bit on the mask thing, because first of all, I'm not saying that masks are a good idea, but to your point, even if I'm in this environment where I'm putting on my, like, I call it being on, right? Like I have friends in TV and that do different events and all that, and you kind of have to turn on a particular part of your personality because you're more outgoing than you normally would be. You kind of have to put on this, side. But however, I can tell that story in this environment and still be vulnerable in the way that I tell that story. I can identify, I can have a conversation with a young business owner that's in his 20s and share, this is how I screwed up when I was in my 20s. Hell, this is how I screwed up 2 months ago. Right. And have that vulnerability and be able to open myself up, even when I'm whenever I'm having a particular aspect of my personality as the predominant one.
Here, I haven't fleshed this out in public, so let's go through it together. But I think there's something here that it's within my line of thinking around sports. So, as young athletes, male athletes, we're often taught strength, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bench this, squat that, deadlift this, right? Like just like max strength. And then oftentimes, female athletes, gymnasts, etc., it's a lot of flexibility, like motion and those types of things. And we see the strength, but then the lacking of the flexibility leads often to a lot of injury. And then maybe we see the flexibility, but lacking the strength may not get to some of those physical feats, right? So we need something that kind of bridges it. And as I've gotten older and a bit more broken from all those years playing, what's become really important to me is mobility. And mobility, as I've heard it defined, is strength through range of motion.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we take the flexibility piece as our emotions and the strength, we can still call it strength, but if mobility is strength through range of motion, how do we have strength through a range of emotions, right? Through our empathy, through our compassion, through our stoicism, through our, whatever we need, right? But the problem is that we're often just given a hammer as a young man that we can be angry and then everything looks like a nail. But really, we need a full toolkit with a wrench and a screwdriver, multiple screwdrivers even, right? To deal with different emotional things. And then we need that strength through range of motion.
Yeah, I really like that a lot. It's as a guy that works out a lot, I was a personal trainer earlier in my life, and I did tons of clients. I had like 13 a day on some days. And so I would stretch with each one. I was a heck of a lot more flexible than I am now. So from a physical standpoint, that's one thing I try to work on, is to try to incorporate that, because I'm 51 years old. I'm in pretty good shape. I'm probably in the best shape that I've been throughout my life. And I started to realize that having that strength and flexibility is what keeps me from dying whenever I do stupid stuff, like, climb up on a ladder that's too high or whatever, and fall. And so, but to take that analogy through, right? Like, that's as a man, having that strength, but then being able to be flexible in the way that strength is displayed is something that's super important. Because, like you said, if we're walking down the street in a city and somebody steps in front of us with a knife, or a gun or whatever, I'm going to stand in front of my wife, even though if it's a knife, she's a boxer, can beat the crap out of the guy. That is my role, right? Like, I'm gonna step up and be strong in that way. But if after that is all settled, if she's upset and scared and crying, I also need to be able to put my arm around her and comfort her and have her comfort me, to say, look, we almost died and that was bad, and all the adrenaline dump and all that. But I think that's to take that further analogy, to be able to be the whole man. I had a guest on not too long ago, and forgive me because I can't remember which one, but talking about this wholeness as a man and talking about being your whole man.
Yeah, and I think that might be just even so another word for the integrated piece. And I think the important part is also, and I'm not saying that you were implying this, but I always think about it like, okay, we put ourselves in this like hero position of like stepping in front of our wife or whatever. But the reality is that if you weren't there and it was your wife and your daughter, she would step in front of your daughter.
Yeah,
right.
100%.
So it's not like, I think sometimes this conversation, and again, not you, but this conversation about masculinity forgets and leaves out the heroicism of people of other genders as well too, and the strength and the ability that they have. And that we could call that, the masculinity within them if we want to choose that language. But that's where like I kind of get like, what's the point in calling this masculine or that feminine when these things exist within all of us, right? That heroicism, your wife would do the exact same thing for your daughter. And I think when we can sit there and say that and remind ourselves of those things, that goes again to that like flexibility we have within the definition, that it doesn't have to just be about us and about other men, but it can be about people and how we show up.
Well, and to your point, and I love to be able to tell these stories having the wife that I have, right? Like, because there is no, and we're in the automotive space. My wife has done 3 builds that are all female automotive builds. And these are welders and tradeswomen and painters and mechanics and all. Like, these are the baddest of the bad when it comes to women in the trades. They're just awesome at what they do. And they tend to be pretty badass girls also. And my wife kind of falls into that category, but yet she can put on her feminine, she is also very feminine. But to your point, if she was there in that same situation, she's perfectly capable of stepping up and doing those. There are some physicality traits, with men and women, there's a difference. And I think in some ways, like, most firefighters are men. All the jobs that tend to be the highest risk, and I think it's because we get dumber with more testosterone, maybe. So we sign up for that stuff. But they're, with the more traditional, but that doesn't diminish the strength of women in this case, right? Like, it doesn't, I'm not here saying if I step in front of my wife, it's because she's too weak to handle it. I step in front of my wife because of my servant leadership role, because that's how I see my job, right? Like, that's part of my job. I open my wife's car door every time. Like, I feel like that's part of serving her and showing her love, and she loves it. Like, that's just part of our deal. So I was rambling a little bit, but that kind of, I'm trying to illustrate your point as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, I guess for me, it's just about like, the statistics definitely bear out what we're saying, that men are predominantly in those roles and those types of things. But I just don't take it as the default anymore, because there's always the anecdote that kind of will break that mold. Like, we look at what's going on in the Middle East, and this isn't a politics podcast, and I don't want to get into that necessarily, but like, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, all Israeli citizens, unless they're like ultra Orthodox Jews, have to serve. So women serve in the military as well too. So like they show that same like bravery and courage and those types of things. And we see women that are just like so badass in like midwifery and working at all hours and helping bring these children into the world. And like there's just all those types of things. So I just don't take it in like absolutes. And I know that we're all like socialized in these ways. And, I walk with my partner down the road, and if the like sidewalk is narrow, I like always walk on the roadside, right? Just because like that's really drilled into me. But I think I just kind of acknowledge, like, this is something my grandmother taught me, right? Like it's a lesson learned, and it works, but like, it just doesn't need to be the default always.
Yeah. I'm curious to that point, how you view doing what you do, how you view chivalry. I grew up in the South, Texas and Oklahoma, which is actually not the traditional South. We call it the heartland or whatever, but kind of in the Southern culture. And same thing. I joke and say it's because I'm more heavily insured, but like I always walk on the street side if we walk together. It's just what I do. I open doors for people, men and women. But
that's the key then, right? It's just
yeah, I'll hold the
show.
door open for guys, just like just because it's civil and there is a chivalrous component to that. But I think we've almost begun to demonize chivalry because there's the assumption, and I know women, some women get really bent out of shape if you open the door for them, which I think is dumb. But it's because somehow we've demonized kindness. The kindness that exists in chivalry, we've almost demonized it to that. The reason I open this, like, what man thinks the reason I'm opening this door is because I think you're too weak to open your own door? I don't know anybody, but
yeah. So I'm Canadian. They joke about us that we like awkwardly hold doors. Like if you're almost like too far away, we'll hold the door for you. You got to kind of like jog
shuffle
to get
up,
to the
right?
door,
Yeah.
right? So there's that joke about us. But I guess this is what I would break this down as, and you set me up perfectly for this. There's a difference between chivalry and kindness, and I think chivalry historically was this like path to, I'll be really crude, like to getting laid, right?
Okay.
Like you do these things because it'll show you as, kind, considerate, you pick up the tab, you do these types of things. And then at the end of it, I'm supposed to like you enough to like sleep with you or those types of things, right? So there's kind of like a loadedness to that, like chivalry.
Tit for tat, no pun intended.
Exactly. So there's that. But then if we like take that kindness out of chivalry and we just say, this is what I do. Like if you're struggling with like you're a big strong dude, 51 years old, imagine you're traveling with your wife and you have like 4 heavy suitcases and they're coming out at the arrivals gate and like you just pulled one and you're struggling to grab the other one. If I'm standing beside you, I'll help you grab that next one just to make sure that you get your suitcase. And that's a kindness, right?
Yeah.
I'll hold the door for you because you're pushing the cart and you got like 4 suitcases. And so I think it's loaded when it's like with the expectation of like, you're supposed to like me or value me because I'm acting this way, versus just a kindness of like, regardless of gender, I'm going to like help you grab that bag, hold that door. I've been in situations, I'm behind someone and their debit card isn't working or something. I'll be like, it's $5. Like, let me pick it up for you, whatever. Yeah. Right. Like it's like there's, I think chivalry has its connotations. I don't hate the word. I'm not going to like rail against it or whatever. But if it's like just kindness to people, like there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And because that's an interesting, I've never actually heard that before because I just don't, the way I define chivalry is kind of like your grandmother taught you, right? Like there's just certain behaviors that you do towards humanity. And how do we navigate that though? Right. I think a lot of men now, especially men my age ish, 40 plus, that kind of grew up with that same teaching. They're almost afraid to be kind to women because of like, we don't know, like I'm not, because I figure if you have a problem with me open the door, that's your problem. I'm still doing it because I'm trying to be nice to you. But a lot of men are not like that, right? Like I'm just, but how do men navigate it? Like, how do they know what to do?
So I think this is where some of our like socialized masculinity gets in the way, right? Like, because we're like, a message that I got from a young age was don't be vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
And if you are unsure of what to do, that puts you in a vulnerable position, so you can never admit it. But imagine going out on a first date and like just getting vulnerable and the check comes or you're asking for the check or something and saying, listen, like I grew up with my grandmother telling me to pick up the bill. This is a first date. How do you want to do this?
Yeah.
Right? Like it's just like, here's where I'm coming from. I'm acknowledging that we're kind of between these stories right now. What makes you comfortable?
Yeah.
Right? And like, on the one hand, that's a man leaning into the vulnerability, but on the other hand, that could be perceived as like, wow, this guy's like in touch with like what's going on. He's willing to like name it and like name what his stakes are. And maybe it's like, you pick up the bill, I'll take us for dessert. Or, let's split the bill this time, or you get it this time. I had such a great time, I'll get it next time. It gives the other person agency to like work with it as well too. And it's a great test for like communication, connection, like all those types of things. So we think that we're losing something by naming our vulnerability and our uncertainty, but we're actually gaining a lot.
Yeah, because I mean, if you don't have those conversations, you're making assumptions, right? And that's, having been married for 30 years, I just recorded a podcast a couple hours ago, and we were talking about communicating, things that are bothering you or things that, and I've been with my wife for 30 years, and we still learn all the time. She's like, "Well, yeah, this happens," or "This is something you do," and I just thought it was kind of the way that it would always be. And I'm like, no, if I know that, I can make that change. Like, I'm fixable. I'm trainable. As I joke and say I'm trainable, but that's actually kind of true. Like, I can retrain my behaviors to better serve her as my wife.
Strength through range of motion.
Right. Yeah. And to be able to continue to work on, like, flexibility is something that just isn't maintained. You have to, you don't just stretch twice and now you're flexible for the rest of your life. You have to continue to do that, especially if you're active, because your muscles want to contract and be tight. So you have to constantly, and I think that, again, if we play up that analogy a little bit more, like that's our traditional upbringing or whatever we went through or any of that kind of stuff that shapes that. But we have to constantly kind of work on those things in order to be an integrated man. We'll use that phrase.
Yeah. And I think like another thing that we're taught as men is that we should know the answer. We should be certain. Right? And so I think that's something that we're struggling with in this time of being between stories as well too, is that I'm not certain who should pick up the tab. I'm not certain how I should hold the door, right? But I think, some of the jujitsu that I often try to do is like, do we have the courage to be vulnerable? Do we have the strength to like change, right? Because those are things that we aspire to be. And so it's like, if you can't have the conversation on, your first, second date, whatever it is, about how we're going to split the tab or whatever, when the stakes are much higher later in your relationship and you're expecting a child, how are you going to talk about like who's going to stay home or go to work, or what's a comfortable split for you and your family, right? Like, these are things that you need to be working on throughout the duration of your relationship.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it would be, as we go through, like you said, being between stories, men are trying to navigate this, but I think women are also trying to navigate it, right? Like, that's something that's super important. I saw this TikTok yesterday, which was basically, it's a young 20-something complaining that her date did not just pick up the check. And then someone kind of did that duet thing, with it. And they're like, so here you are telling everybody what a badass woman you are, independent, don't need a man, all these things. And now you're complaining that same man didn't pick up the check for you on the first date. Yeah. Right. And so like this, women have to be vulnerable also to try to, like, we're trying to navigate, both of us are trying to navigate what this looks like. And I'm not in the dating scene, obviously, but throughout, in talking to my daughter and all of those things, it's something the women have to take just as much responsibility, I think, as we do, right?
Yeah, and this is where, like, I think it's a really liberating conversation. So, you had to glance through some of our work stuff and whatnot. Like, I use the word patriarchy very liberally, and because to me, that's the system, right? In order to change the system and the culture, I gotta name the system and the culture. But often when we use the word patriarchy, people think of, a group of old hooded men that are like pulling these puppet strings and making the world go as it is. But, we all existed just as we all existed in capitalism. And women and mothers play a huge role in upholding the system as it is, right? Two quick examples, building even on what you said around sharing the check or whatever. On the dating scene, you go on some women's profiles or whatever, and it's like, I don't want to talk to you unless you're 6 feet, 6 figures, 6 inches, right? And you're like, okay, like, you're putting men into a box of like what serves you, like you're upholding the system there. And then another example I think of my buddy some years ago ran a sock company, and I think I helped him with like a Christmas market or something like that. And there was these awesome like Saved by the Bell socks. They were kind of like turquoise and purple, and they had squiggles and zags and whatnot. And this little boy comes running up, and he's super excited, grabs them. He's like, "Mom, look at these socks." And she goes, "No, those are girl socks." Right?
Interesting.
And,
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not like when we're complaining about these things and being between stories and these types of things, it's not just like vilifying men. It's talking about the system and the culture that we have that leads to these outcomes. And absolutely, women and, you know, trans and non-binary people, we're all navigating this together, and we all have a role to play in it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'd love Saved by the Bell socks. Those sound awesome. First of all,
Yeah.
I have a bunch of socks that are purple and pink and yellow and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that first one, because I don't know if you've seen them, but you'll see these interviews with these young women that will be listing these things out, have to make over $150,000 a year. And then, you know, all of those things. And then like they will put up the percentage of men that actually satisfy. It's like 2.5% of men. And so like, good luck what you're, you know, and good luck finding that man who fits that very materialistic, you know, criteria. And it's funny because a lot of times the girls that are saying that don't meet any, you know, if you ask the guy kind of what his ideal, none of them meet those ideals on the other side of things, which is ridiculous on both sides, right? But yeah, it's like we have these, we're all just making this crap up as we go along, quite honestly, right?
Yeah, and I think like in that there's a lot of power too. If we're making it up, that means we can make it up in a different way, right? Like
Yeah.
These conversations do change over time and place. They were different 100 years ago. They're different in Saudi Arabia. You know, we get to be like, there's power in saying that, right? And having those conversations.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this has been super interesting. I don't know if we talked about the things you wanted to talk about, but if there is, we talked about a ton of stuff, and I'm really encouraged to know that there are men out there, women too, that are out there trying to facilitate this growth and to help men, you know, be more integrated and to be better versions of themselves. Right. Like that's our whole objective with Maxed Out Man, is to help you. And, you know, obviously we will take a particular path that we try to teach men to do that. But we are, with this podcast and with people we bring in, it's really that more integrated side of things. And I really appreciate your perspective. And how do we find you? How do we find more information about what you got going on and learn more about you?
Yeah. So nextgenmen.ca, that's us, the .ca. We're a Canadian organization, but we are growing a little over the border as well too. We have a weekly newsletter that goes out called The Future of Masculinity, and you can actually subscribe to that at thefuturemasculinity.com. And then if you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn, Jake Stika, Stika, and I'm happy to connect there. Appreciate you, Kevin, for facilitating these conversations and the work you do to help men find a way to being integrated.
Thanks. I really enjoy these. These are conversations that I ordinarily would never have, probably. And so this has opened up a new world for me by being able to have a lot of these conversations. So I appreciate you being willing to come on and share. So find Jake at all those. I'll put those in the show notes as well. If you're interested in more stuff about Maxed Out Man, go to maxedoutman.com, find us on socials, and make sure you check out some of our free challenges and other materials that we have. So thanks, Jake. I appreciate you, man. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too, brother.
If you're looking to really maximize your life and become the man you were made to be, head over to maxedoutman.com and get your journey started today.